Senator Ayotte.
Thank you. Mr. Harris, I wanted to ask you, I think the testimony has been here today, and my understanding is that this process is being significantly expedited to admit these refugees from the Canadian government. Do you believe that there are some risks that are created when you rush this kind of program? Because what I've seen on some of the quotes of some individuals who are current Canadian intelligence officials, that they're saying that there was a clear risk, given the pace at which security screeners would have to work to interview, select, process such high volumes of applicants. And then I've heard other quotes saying that that could create vulnerabilities because of, you know, at the time this is a undertaking. And then, of course, our own intelligence officials in the United States have expressed concerns about what information we do have to be able to vet. So I wanted to ask you about what are some of the risks here?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the risks are manifest, as has been indicated, and of course, as many experts and many of those who've been explicitly involved in the exercise have reflected. I believe there were remarks made by Mr. Van Kessel that have been published, and he had significant responsibility in the Canadian immigration side of things and was concerned about the speed of things and some of the priorities and influences that could in theory be brought to bear. There is the issue of efficacy, as my colleague Mr. Mammon has indicated, when there are so many people who are so rushed and might rightly or wrongly feel under pressure, things can happen. And it may be useful in this context to reflect on work not so much by a security specialist as by an economist. They do have their uses, we're told. I.M. Stelzer, who has actually done an appraisal on the generous assumption that the assessment for security purposes of people coming in might be, for the sake of argument, 99% accurate and reliable. What he said, reflecting on the American context of a 10,000 intake from Syria, was that if only 1% of the 10,000 entrants or 100 applicants will have slipped through the vetting net, then it might be estimated that the, I think he was saying that the units that attacked France in November had about 8 to 20 people on them. Involved in them. And so if you work on that assumption, you would have, for a group of 10,000, at just a 1% failure rate, between 5 and 8 terrorist units, each capable of doing to one of our cities what they had done to Paris. And if you then multiply those numbers for the 25,000 contemplated in Canada, you could be looking at between 12 and 20 terrorist units of the very kind that tore apart portions of Paris earlier this year. If I may add to this, a related humanitarian consideration. It has been said that Canada, of course, is rightly proud of its traditions with regard to assisting people. But the respected Center for Immigration Studies in Washington has made a very interesting point. It says that, now again in the U.S. context, and I quote, "For what it costs to resettle one Middle Eastern refugee in the United States for 5 years, about 12 refugees can be helped in the Middle East for 5 years, or 61 refugees can be helped for 1 year." And when one considers some of the difficulties that one might be dealing with worldwide in the refugee crisis that, depending on definitions, could extend to 60 million people on the planet, it is even theoretically possible, I suppose, that many of those other refugees who won't have the privileged treatment that the relative few going to Canada might have, might expect something akin to an apology from us for not diverting funds from certain Canadian programs to international assistance. That in turn is relevant in security terms because, of course, that kind of diversion of funds would allow for more concentration on the security side in Canada and indeed allow funds for security per se in Canada.
Thank you. I wanted to also follow up on the issue. I represent New Hampshire, and we are a state, of course, that borders Canada. And By the way, we do a lot of important economic trade with Canada, so I trace my own roots to Canada a bit, with Ayotte as a last name. So I wanted to ask about this issue in the context of Mr. Mandel on the border issue. So with tens of thousands of newly arrived individuals, what are ways that Canada can ensure that refugees, obviously that there's close information sharing and that refugees aren't able to cross the border into the United States? And do you think that there are going to have to be any changes made there on the U.S.-Canadian border? Is that going to put some more pressure on local agents there who I know work very hard? So I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I would like to venture that we need to get communication, more communication. I talked about intel earlier. There is intel, but there could be more. And it won't take much, one or two, to come across, sneak across, and do a lot of damage. So I think the communication lines need to be bolstered. The relationships we have has been good, but I think everything can just improve, and possibly more task forces as well.
So it's something we're going to have to focus on. And
Absolutely. The awareness of what's going on there, the daily happenings, I think our agents need to be aware of, the intel, keeping the agents up to date, up to speed on what's going on.
well, that's helpful because Senator Heitkamp and I have a bill that is focused on our northern border and making sure that we're focusing on ensuring that border gets attention and that we're properly ensuring that communication exists. And so we passed it out of this committee. I'm hoping that we might get that passed in the Senate this year. And so I appreciate all of you being here today. Thank you, Chairman.